It was the height of summer, one of those oppressive heat waves where the air feels thick enough to choke on. Everyone on my street had their windows wide open, hoping for even the smallest hint of a breeze. Everyone except for my neighbor, Mr. Wilkins. His house stood like an anomaly, the windows sealed tight, curtains drawn, and not a single sign of airflow escaping. I'd only recently moved into the neighborhood, and the oddity of it struck me immediately. Mr. Wilkins wasn't like the other neighbors. While the rest of us would wave or chat across fences, he kept to himself. His lawn was always perfectly manicured, his house impeccably clean, but the man himself was a ghost, a pale, hunched figure you'd catch glimpses of at dusk, quickly vanishing behind his door. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he just liked his privacy. But as the days dragged on and the heat grew more unbearable, my curiosity got the best of me. Why the hell would someone keep their windows shut in this suffocating weather? It didn't make any sense. One evening, as I was watering my plants, I saw him in his front yard. Mr. Wilkins, dressed in a long-sleeved shirt despite the blistering heat, was fiddling with something in his garden. I figured it was as good a time as any to make an introduction. "Evening, Mr. Wilkins," I called out, trying to sound casual. "Hot enough for you?" He didn't respond right away. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though every action required immense concentration. Finally, he turned to me, his face shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat. "Evening," he replied, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. His eyes, though, were unsettlingly sunken, bloodshot, with dark circles beneath them. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "You know, you might feel a lot better if you opened your windows," I said with a chuckle, gesturing toward his house. "Get some air flowing in there." For a moment, I thought he might laugh, but instead, his expression hardened. "I don't open the windows," he said, his voice flat. "Why not?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. His gaze drifted to his house, then back to me. "It's not safe." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned away, heading back toward his front door. "Best you don't concern yourself with it," he muttered, disappearing inside before I could press further. That should have been the end of it. I should have let it go, chalked it up to eccentricity and moved on. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. "It's not safe." What could he possibly mean by that? It started a few nights later. I had just drifted off to sleep when I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a soft, scratching noise. I sat up, listening intently, but the sound quickly stopped. Figuring it was just the house settling, I tried to fall back asleep. But the next night, the noise came again, this time louder. A rhythmic tapping, like nails gently scraping against glass. It was coming from the direction of Mr. Wilkins' house. I got up, pulled the blinds aside, and peered out the window. His house was dark, no lights on, windows still tightly shut. The tapping continued, growing more frantic, almost desperate, like something or someone was trying to get in. My pulse quickened. Was Mr. Wilkins okay? I stepped outside, the night air thick and humid, and crossed over to his front yard. The noise had stopped by the time I got there, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at his windows, half expecting something to leap out at me from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the dark, oppressive stillness of the night. I went back inside, unsettled but unsure of what to do. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. The next day, I ran into Mrs. Jennings, one of the older women who lived in the neighborhood for decades. She was watering her garden, and I decided to ask her about Mr. Wilkins. She gave me a knowing look when I brought up his name. "Wilkins," she muttered, shaking her head. "That man, there's something not right about him." "What do you mean?" She glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "He moved in about 5 years ago, after his wife passed. Strange things started happening not long after that. No one talks to him much. I don't think he likes people prying." "What kind of strange things?" I pressed. Mrs. Jennings hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "Sometimes, late at night, you'll see lights in his windows. Flickering, like candles. And shadows, figures moving around inside. But no one ever sees him with visitors. He's always alone." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Have you ever asked him about it?" She laughed, but it was a humorless sound. "No, dear. Some things are better left alone." I walked away from the conversation more confused and disturbed than ever. Shadows, flickering lights, and that night, the noises. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. That evening, I decided to keep a closer watch. Around midnight, I turned off all my lights and positioned myself by the window, peering through the blinds at Mr. Wilkins' house. For the longest time, nothing happened. No movement, no sounds. Just the quiet hum of the night. But around 2 a.m., I saw it. The faintest flicker of light from behind his closed curtains. At first, it was just a glow, but then I saw shadows, moving shadows, like figures pacing back and forth inside the house. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way he had visitors at this hour, right? So who or what was inside with him? And then, the scratching started again. This time, it was louder, more frantic, like something was trying to claw its way in. I was frozen, my eyes locked on his window, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A face. Pale, gaunt, hollow-eyed, pressed against the glass from the inside, staring out into the darkness. But it wasn't Mr. Wilkins. The figure was barely human, its features distorted, too long, too thin, its eyes wide and empty. It stared out into the night as if searching for something, its bony fingers dragging across the glass with that awful, scraping sound. I stumbled back from the window, my heart in my throat. What the hell had I just seen? There was no way that thing, whatever it was, could be human. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, every creak, made my skin crawl. I wanted to confront Mr. Wilkins, demand answers, but fear held me back. What if I wasn't supposed to know? What if, by noticing, I'd already put myself in danger? The next day, I stayed inside, curtains drawn, avoiding the front of my house altogether. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there had to be a logical explanation. But deep down, I knew better. Something was very, very wrong in that house. That evening, just after sunset, I heard a knock at my door. My stomach dropped. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Mr. Wilkins stood there, his eyes hollow and dark, his skin pale as ever. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I saw you looking." My heart stopped. "You should have listened," he continued, his voice low, almost regretful. "I keep the windows shut for a reason. They can't get out if the windows are closed. But now they know you're watching." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, trembling, cold sweat dripping down my back. That night, I heard the scratching again, this time, much closer. At my own window. And when I looked out, I saw it. That same gaunt face, twisted and wrong, staring back at me from the darkness. I slammed the curtains shut, heart pounding so hard I could barely hear over the blood rushing in my ears. That thing, whatever it was, had been watching me. Staring at me through my own window with its hollow, soulless eyes. My skin crawled just thinking about it. I backed away from the window, trying to steady my breathing, but the silence that followed was suffocating. The oppressive heat of the night seemed to cling to me, wrapping itself around my throat like invisible hands. The air inside my house felt thick, heavy, and no matter how hard I tried to shake the feeling, I couldn't help but feel like something or someone was watching me from the shadows. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, all the lights on, phone clutched tightly in my hand. I wanted to call someone, anyone, and explain what I had just seen, but the words felt ridiculous. How could I even begin to describe that thing? Would anyone believe me? Hell, I didn't even believe myself. Maybe it was a trick of the light, an overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion and the heat. But deep down, I knew. I knew it was real. And whatever was in Mr. Wilkins' house had seen me. The next few days, I avoided my neighbor's house like the plague. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. The slightest sound made me jump, and the once welcoming heat of the sun felt more like a warning, a reminder of that night and the gaunt face that had peered into my soul. I was about to start questioning my sanity when something else happened, something I couldn't rationalize away. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was mowing my lawn, trying to keep busy, trying not to think. That's when I smelled it, a stench so putrid and vile that I gagged instantly. It was like rotting meat, but sharper, mixed with something chemical, something unnatural. I looked around, expecting to see a dead animal or a garbage bag split open nearby, but there was nothing. The smell seemed to be drifting over from Mr. Wilkins' house. I turned off the lawnmower and stood there, staring at his sealed windows. The curtains were drawn, as always, and there was no sign of movement inside. But the smell, it was stronger the closer I got to his house. I could feel bile rising in my throat as I walked toward his front door, the stench burning my nostrils. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I was worried something had happened to him, or maybe I just wanted an excuse to figure out what the hell was going on. Either way, I found myself standing on his doorstep, hand raised to knock. But before my knuckles could even make contact with the door, it creaked open just a sliver. Cold air rushed out, but it wasn't refreshing. It was freezing. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, unnatural in the middle of a blistering summer. And the smell. God, the smell was overpowering now, a thick, nauseating miasma that hit me like a brick wall. "Mr. Wilkins," I called out, my voice shaky. "You okay in there?" No response. The silence inside was almost tangible, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open a little further. The interior was dark, unnaturally so. I could barely make out the faint outline of furniture, but something about the shadows was wrong. They stretched and twisted in ways that defied logic, as if the darkness inside his house had a life of its own. I stepped forward, just enough to see down the hallway. And that's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, half in shadow, half illuminated by the sliver of light from the open door. It was Mr. Wilkins, but he looked different, gaunter than ever, his skin pale and almost translucent, his eyes wide and sunken. He didn't move, Didn't he speak? He just stared at me, unblinking. For a moment, we were locked in place, neither of us moving, neither of us speaking. Then, in the faintest whisper, I heard him say, "You shouldn't have looked." Before I could respond, before I could even comprehend what he meant, the door slammed shut in my face with a force that rattled the walls. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and for a few seconds, I just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. The smell was still clinging to me, lingering in the air like a reminder of whatever lurked inside that house. I staggered back to my own yard, my mind reeling. Something wasn't right about Mr. Wilkins, something far worse than I had imagined. And whatever it was, it knew I had seen it. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. What had I seen? What was happening in that house? Was Mr. Wilkins even still human? Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside made my heart race. The temperature had dropped again, unusual for summer, and a thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the street in an eerie, unnatural silence. The world felt wrong, twisted. Around 2 a.m., the scratching started again. This time, it wasn't just faint taps. It was loud, insistent, like something was frantically trying to claw its way through the glass. My heart leaped into my throat as I shot up in bed, listening. The sound was coming from the window, my window. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay under the covers, to pretend I didn't hear it. But the scratching grew louder, more desperate, until I could almost feel it vibrating through the walls. Trembling, I slowly pulled the curtains aside and peered out. Standing outside my window, barely visible in the fog, was a figure tall, thin, with hollow eyes and long, spindly limbs. Its face was pressed against the glass, fingers dragging across the surface with that sickening, scraping sound. But it wasn't just one figure. There were several of them, standing just beyond the fog's edge, watching, waiting. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, all fixed on me. I stumbled back, choking on my own fear. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was almost like they were taunting me, waiting for something. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting me from my panic. I grabbed it, hands shaking, and saw a message. It was from Mr. Wilkins. "Don't let them in. They're not human." The message was followed by another. "It's too late for me. But you still have time." My heart raced as I stared at the words, the implications sinking in. I didn't know how long I had or what exactly these things wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. They were getting closer. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The scratching, the tapping, it didn't stop. The figures remained outside, motionless, just staring. Occasionally, one of them would move closer, pressing its face against the window, but none of them tried to break through. Not yet. I spent the entire night huddled in the corner of my room, phone clutched in my hand, reading and rereading Mr. Wilkins' messages. What did he mean by "it's too late for me"? Was he in danger, or had he already changed? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the figures outside slowly began to retreat, vanishing into the fog. The scratching stopped. The silence returned. But I knew it wasn't over. Mr. Wilkins' final message replayed in my mind over and over again: "You still have time." But how much time did I have, and what would happen when it ran out? I realized then that Mr. Wilkins had been right all along. The windows weren't just a barrier to the heat. They were a protection, a fragile shield keeping something far worse at bay. But now, they knew about me. They knew I was watching. And they were just waiting for me to break.